The sun shone high in the sky, but its rays could barely penetrate the heavy atmosphere of that humble house. The walls, marked by time and neglect, seemed to carry the weight of the constant fights that echoed there. In the center of the room, Dlamini, a man with hard features and a look always full of contempt, vented his anger on Bali, his wife. She, visibly weakened, maintained a firm posture, protecting her daughters, Zabida, age 12, and Nima, just 7, who observed everything in silence, hugging each other in the corner of the room. "You are useless." Dlamini's voice resounded like thunder, each word filled with contempt. "Not even a male child was able to give it to me. What else can you do for this family?" Bali, with shaking hands, leaned on the old table that occupied the center of the room. Her breathing was labored, and her eyes, although tired, showed the determination of a mother who would do anything for her daughters. She didn't respond. He knew that any word would only fuel Dlamini's fury further. The girls watched in silence, but their hearts were beating fast. Zabida squeezed her sister's hand, as if she wanted to protect her from all the evil that came from that man who was supposed to be a safe haven, but who was nothing more than a constant nightmare. Naima hid her face in Zabida's shoulder, trying to stifle the sobs that were beginning to escape. Suddenly, Bali tried to take a step towards her daughters, but her legs wouldn't obey her. Her body gave way, and she fell to the ground with a thud. The girls screamed in unison. "Mother!" Zabida was the first to run to her, kneeling beside her, holding her cold hands. "Mom, wake up, please!" His voice was desperate, and tears began to run down his face. Dlamini, standing near the door, just watched the scene with disdain. "It's nothing. She's faking it to get attention." His voice indifferent cut like a blade. He slammed the door open and walked out, leaving behind the sound of his daughters crying. Time seemed frozen. Zabida gently shook Bali's body, trying to bring her back. "Mom, we need you. Don't leave us." Naima cried softly beside her, holding the hem of her mother's dress. The silence that followed was deafening. When night fell, the house was plunged into a darkness that seemed even more oppressive than usual. Only the sound of the wind came through the poorly sealed windows. Bali did not get up. He did not respond to his daughter's pleas. Her fight was over, and the weight of life had finally overcome her. Zabida couldn't sleep. Sitting next to her mother's body, she looked at Naima, who had fallen asleep on the floor, tired from crying. Zabida's heart was filled with fear. She knew that without her mother, they were alone, totally alone. When Dlamini returned later that night, the smell of alcohol filled the room. He barely glanced at Bali on the ground. He walked straight past, staggering towards the bedroom, as if nothing had happened. Zabida felt an anger he had never experienced before. How could he be so cold, so indifferent? She wanted to scream, to confront him, but she knew that would only put her and Naima in more danger. At that moment, Zabida made a decision. She needed to protect her sister, even if it meant facing the world alone. The silence of that night was broken only by the sound of Dlamini's heavy footsteps in the hallway, as Zabida silently hugged Naima and made a silent promise. "I won't let him destroy us." And so, the tragedy that began with Bali's death began a new struggle for Zabida and Naima, the first of many days in which they would have to fight to survive. The small room where Zabida and Naima now lived felt more like a prison than a home. The walls were damp, with seepage marks forming designs that looked like sinister shadows in the dim light of a lamp hanging from the ceiling. The smell of mold was constant, mixed with the smell of sour food coming from the makeshift kitchen. The mattress they slept on was thin and uncomfortable, a cold and insufficient refuge for two girls who had lost not only their mother, but any semblance of comfort or familial love. Zabida, sitting on the floor with her legs crossed, was breaking off a dry piece of bread that she had found earlier. Naima, at his side, looked at the piece in her hands with big, hungry eyes, but didn't say a word. The silence between the two was filled by the sound of the heavy footsteps of Adesawa, Dlamini's new wife, who walked around the house like a queen in her castle. Zabida watched her sister closely, trying to hide her own hunger. The piece of bread he was holding would only be enough for Naima. She would rather watch her sister eat than deal with the painful sound of her empty stomach. The bedroom door opened with a bang, and Adesua entered with firm steps and a cold look. In his hands, he carried a plate of poorly served food, which appeared to be a mixture of burnt rice and pieces of vegetables left over from some more elaborate dish. She set the plate down dismissively. "Here is what you deserve. Nothing more than scraps." His voice was full of sarcasm, and his dark eyes watched the girls as if they were mere disposable objects. Naima hesitantly crawled over to the plate, but before she could grab a piece, Adesua kicked the plate, scattering the food across the dirty floor. "In fact, you don't deserve anything. If it were up to me, they wouldn't even be here." Zabita stood up suddenly, but suppressed the anger that was bubbling inside her. Fear stopped her from acting. Instead, he bent down, picked up the empty plate, and held Neima's hand, who was beginning to cry silently. "Don't cry. I will take care of you," whispered Zabita, lightly squeezing her sister's fingers as a silent promise. Adesua laughed dismissively, crossing his arms and watching them as if it were a victory. "You two were dead weight. If they knew what was best for you, they would disappear from this house." Silence reigned again after Adesua left, but Zabita knew it would not last long. While Naima slept curled up on the mattress, hugging the small blanket that still had the faint scent of her mother, Zabita stayed awake, her thoughts boiling in search of a way out of that situation. She got up to close the bedroom door, only to unintentionally hear voices coming from the room. Curiosity and survival instinct made her approach, walking barefoot so as not to make any noise. Outside, Adesua was talking to Jabari, a man Zabita had never seen before, but whose presence exuded danger. "Glamini is a fool," Adesua began, his voice low and full of contempt. "He still thinks these girls deserve to stay here. But once he's out of the way, this whole place will be ours. You know what to do, Jabari." Zabita's heart quickened, and she held her breath. "What about the children?" asked Jabari, his voice thick with indifference. "Do you want to get rid of them too?" Adesua laughed, a cold, inhuman sound that echoed through the halls of the house. "It is clear. They don't mean anything. I want everything for myself, and I won't let anyone get in my way." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Zabita's feet. She felt her blood run cold in her veins as she tried to process what she had just heard. Without wasting time, he returned to the room with hurried steps, closing the door behind him carefully so as not to make any noise. Naima was still sleeping, but Zabita knew she needed to act quickly. Kneeling down beside her sister, she rocked her gently. "Naima, wake up," he whispered, trying to hide the panic in his voice. Naima opened her eyes slowly, blinking to adjust to the darkness of the room. "What it was?" he asked, his voice groggy with sleep. Zabita held his hands tightly and spoke in a firm but low tone. "We need to get out of here. Now." The camera shows Naima's confused look as Zabita gets up, starting to gather the few things they had. The air in the room felt heavier, and the distant sound of conversation in the room reminded Zabita that they didn't have much time. She looked at her sister and, for the first time, felt a twinge of hope mixed with fear. "I didn't know how, but I would do everything to protect Naima, no matter what the cost." The transition to the next scene begins with the sound of the wind blowing outside, as Zabita carefully opens the window, looking at the stranger waiting for them on the other side. The night seemed to swallow everything around. The wind blew through the trees, bringing with it the sound of dry leaves being dragged along the ground. The road was deserted, lit only by the pale light of the moon that was hidden between the dark clouds. Zabita tightened the strap of her backpack around her shoulders, feeling the weight not only of the clothes she had managed to carry, but of the responsibility of keeping Naima safe. With each step, she heard the rustle of vegetation and the muffled sound of her own breathing. Naima, walking behind her, tried to keep up, but her small legs couldn't support the rush and fear that moved them. "Zabita," whispered Naima, her voice thick with exhaustion and dread. She tripped over a rock, falling to her knees on the rough ground. Zabita stopped immediately, bending down to help her sister. "I'm scared," Naima confessed, holding her sister's hands as if her life depended on it. Zabita took a deep breath, ignoring the tears that threatened to fall. Me too, he admitted, his voice firm but gentle. But we need to be strong. Trust in me. She wiped Naima's knees with her hands, trying to ease the discomfort, and lifted her up. The quick hug he gave his sister was not just to comfort her, but also to find the strength to move forward. They started walking again, the sound of their hurried footsteps mixing with the noise of the wind. Zabita knew they couldn't stop. At any moment, Jabari could find them, and she didn't want to think about what would happen if they were captured. It was then that she heard, in the distance, a sound that made her heart stop for a moment. Quick footsteps and a hoarse voice calling them. "I know you guys are here. There's no point running away." It was Jabari, and he was closer than Zabita would like to admit. Zabita pulled Naima off the road, plunging them both into the darkness of the forest that surrounded her. They hid behind a large tree, their backs pressed against the rough bark. Naima trembled, trying to hold back crying. Zabita hugged her tightly, her hand lightly covering her sister's mouth to avoid any sound that could give them away. With every step Jabari took, the ground seemed to vibrate, and his heavy breathing was like a warning that their time was running out. "You can't hide forever," he shouted, frustration evident in his voice. For a moment, everything was silent. Zabita barely dared to breathe, while Naima squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could make her invisible. Then, the footsteps began to move away. Jabari hadn't found them. Zabita let out a silent sigh, but knew they couldn't stay there for long. "Come on," he whispered to Naima, pulling her by the hand. They got back on the road, running as fast as their tired legs would carry them. The cold of the night cut into the skin, but fear was a greater force, driving them forward. Suddenly, a beam of light illuminated the darkness ahead. Zabita stopped abruptly, pulling Naima back. The glare of an old car's headlights cut across the road like a sword, slowly advancing towards him. For a moment, Zabita thought about hiding again, but something about the way the car moved seemed different. It wasn't a frantic chase, but rather a cautious movement, as if the driver was looking for something or someone. "Who will it be?" Naima asked, her voice low and full of uncertainty. Zabita squeezed her hand, looking at the car as it approached. She knew this was a risky bet. It could be someone willing to help them, or another danger lurking. But at that moment, between the light of the car and the darkness of what they left behind, Zabita knew he needed to make a decision. The sound of the engine filled the air as the light grew brighter, revealing the fragile silhouettes of the two sisters on the side of the road. Zabita closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage, before taking the first step into the unknown. The scene ends with the two, illuminated by the light of the headlight, staring at the car that was slowly stopping in front of them, while the sound of the wind and the engine together created a suspense that hung in the air, leaving the audience anxious to know what would happen next. "Follow." The car slowly stopped in front of the girls, with the engine emitting a low, continuous roar that seemed to pierce the silence of the road. The light from the headlights revealed the dust that hung in the air, highlighting the small, trembling silhouettes of Zabita and Naima. The driver's door creaked open, and a middle-aged man got out. He wore a worn jacket and worn jeans, and his eyes expressed both concern and caution. He looked at the two of them for a moment before asking, his voice deep and hesitant, "What are two girls doing alone at this time of night?" Zabita stepped forward, placing herself between the man and her sister. Despite feeling scared, she knew she needed to try. Taking a deep breath, he replied in a shaky but determined voice, "Please, just help us. We're running away from bad people." Naima, clinging to Zabita's arm, looked like a shadow, small and silent, with wide eyes staring at the stranger. The man looked at them for what seemed like an eternity, assessing the situation. He looked at the empty road behind the girls, then up at the sky, where heavy clouds threatened to collapse into rain at any moment. He hesitated. His hands touched the car door as he weighed the risks of getting involved. But when he looked at Zabita again, he saw something in her eyes that made him stop. It was courage mixed with desperation, the determination of someone who had no other options. Sighing, he opened the back door and said in a tone of voice that tried to sound firm, "Come in. But first, tell me, who are these bad people?" Zabita looked at Naima, who was now holding her hand tightly, before responding, "They want to hurt us. Please, sir, just take us away from here." The man nodded, clearly still having doubts, but unable to ignore the urgency in the girl's eyes. He helped Nima into the car and closed the door behind her before looking at Zabita. "You did well to protect your sister. Now tell me, where should we go?" Zabita swallowed. I don't know. Just somewhere safe." The car's interior was plain and shabby, with cracked leather seats and a faint smell of tobacco. The radio played softly an old song that mixed with the sound of the engine. As the man drove, Zabita looked out the window, watching the dark road, fearing she would see the headlights of another car behind them. Naima, sitting next to her, rested her head on her sister's shoulder. Despite her tiredness, Zabita did not allow herself to relax. "You're lucky to have her," said the man, breaking the silence. "Not everyone would do what you did today." Zabita didn't respond, but her hands squeezed Naima's, as if reassuring herself that she would never leave her. After some time on the road, the man broke the silence again. "I know a place. It's not much, but it's safe. Let's go there." The car turned a curve and began to climb a dirt road. The city lights had disappeared, and everything around was darkness, except for the vehicle's headlights. Finally, they arrived at a simple building, surrounded by trees. It was the orphanage. The man parked and got out of the car, go to the door to help the girls out. As they entered the building, the air felt warmer, and the smell of old wood mingled with the distant sound of children laughing somewhere. A gentle-looking woman, with hair tied in a tight bun and glasses on the tip of her nose, came to meet them. "Who are these girls?" he asked, looking at the man. He quickly explained, "I found them on the road. They need help." The woman looked at Zabita and Naima, her eyes softening as she took in their vulnerability. "You're safe here," she said with a reassuring smile. "My name is Mary, and I am the director of this place. They don't need to worry anymore." Naima looked at Zabita, who hugged her tightly. For the first time in a long time, the younger sister smiled, a shy but genuine smile. "We could be together, can't we?" Naima asked, her voice full of hope. Zabita looked at her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Always together," she replied firmly, like a promise she knew she would do anything to keep. As Mary led them to a simple but welcoming room, Zabita felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: relief. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The sound of the man's car driving away was the last thing they heard before they laid down on the narrow bed, side by side. Naima fell asleep almost immediately, but Zabita stayed awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the future held for them. The next morning, as the sun began to illuminate the orphanage, Mary knocked softly on the bedroom door. "There's a couple here," she said with a hesitant smile. "They want to meet you." Zabita felt her stomach drop. She knew the next day would bring new challenges, but now at least she had a promise to keep her sister by her side. The morning sun illuminated the orphanage courtyard, where children played and ran freely. The sound of laughter and footsteps echoed through the place, bringing a sense of normality, albeit temporary, to Zabita and Naima. The two were sitting together in a corner, away from the movement, with Naima holding a small rag doll that she had found in the room. Zabita observed her surroundings carefully, as if she were still on alert, ready to protect her sister from any threat. But there, at that moment, the tension seemed to give way to a strange calm. Suddenly, Director Mary approached, accompanied by a well-dressed couple. The man, in a crisp suit, had a polite smile, while the woman, wearing a floral dress, held a small bag and looked at the children curiously. Mary pointed to the two sisters and walked towards them, bringing the couple along. Zabita noticed the movement and, instinctively, pulled Naima closer, as if wanting to protect her from something she still didn't fully understand. "Zabita, Naima, this is Mr. and Mrs. Carter," said Mary in a gentle but formal voice. "They came to meet you." The couple approached, and the woman bent down to be at Naima's level. "You are beautiful," she said with a warm smile. "So sweet and delicate. You would be perfect for our family." Naima looked at Zabita with wide, confused eyes, seeking guidance. Zabita stood up suddenly, placing herself between her sister and the Carters. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice firm but filled with fear. Mr. Carter stepped forward, tried to explain, "We're looking for a daughter to adopt. And your sister? She looks exactly like we imagined. You must understand." But Zabita shook his head forcefully before he could finish. "We are a package deal," he declared, his voice shaking but determined. "Either they take both, or neither." The silence that followed was heavy, and Mrs. Carter's smile disappeared for a moment. She stood up slowly, looking at her husband, who looked uncertain. "But 2 children? This could be complicated," she murmured, hesitating. Mary intervened before the couple could continue. "They've been through a lot," the director said firmly, looking directly at the Carters. "We cannot separate them. Of course, it would be easier to take just one, but these girls are inseparable. If you cannot accept them together, perhaps this is not the right time for you." The couple exchanged glances, and for a moment it looked like they might insist. But realizing Zabita's determination and Mary's support, they sighed and retreated. "Let's think about it," said Mr. Carter, visibly uncomfortable. The couple walked away, leaving the girls alone with Mary again. As the Carters disappeared through the orphanage door, Nima tugged at the hem of Zabita's shirt. "They don't want us?" he asked, his voice low and full of uncertainty. Zabita knelt beside her sister, holding her hands. "It doesn't matter," she replied with a soft smile. "As long as we are together, we will be fine. They didn't separate us, and that's what matters." For the first time in weeks, Zabita saw Nima's face light up with a genuine smile, something that seemed impossible days ago. Mary watched from afar, a discreet smile on her lips. She knew that the bond between the 2 sisters was something rare and special, something that could not be broken. "You are strong," she said softly, moving closer again. "And they're safe here. Remember this." Later, Zabita and Nima were in the courtyard, playing for the first time since arriving at the orphanage. Zabita laughed as she spun Nima around, holding her small hands tightly, and Nima laughed, forgetting, at least for a moment, the fears and sadness they had faced. The camera showed the 2 from afar, surrounded by other children, but standing out with their newfound joy. Sunlight bathed the scene, creating a contrast between the darkness of the past and the hope of the future. The final narration began softly, accompanying the image of the 2 sisters running together through the courtyard. Even though they were rejected by their own father, Zabita and Nima found something more powerful: the unbreakable love of sisters. No matter how difficult the journey is, with love, there is always hope. The camera continued to slowly pan away, until the children's happy voices and laughter became just a distant echo, and the screen faded to black, leaving the audience with a sense of relief and inspiration. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.